Hello Internet, and welcome to this my video about the Treaty of Karlowitz. Now, why the Treaty of Karlowitz? Well, because it's a turning point in European history, sort of the official turning point in European history, though the turning point itself was, in my opinion, happening sort of continuously over the last 16 years before this. However, I have been told that sometimes it's depressing that what I mostly focus on is battles and wars and stuff, because, it's battles and wars, people are dying, a lot of people are suffering, so I figured I would do the opposite. I would talk about, actually the real opposite, a peace treaty that ended 16 years of war. So yeah, the Treaty of Karlowitz, which was the end of the Turkish Habsburg Wars, 1683 to 1699, and the reason this is so important is that this was basically where the Ottomans' invasion of Western Europe ended. They, to a certain degree, of course, but that was the turning point in the expansion of the Ottoman Empire and the dominance of the Habsburgs in Central Europe. So, I still get to talk about war! Isn't it awesome? Anyway, enjoy. On the 26th of January 1699, in what is today Sremski Karlovci or something in Serbia, and I apologize heartedly to any Serbs who happen to be watching this movie for my more than atrocious pronunciation of their language, back then known as Karlowitz, a city that was in that particular time a part of the Ottoman Empire. Representatives from said Ottoman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire under the Habsburg monarchy met to finally hammer out a peace treaty to a war that had been raging for the last 16 years. This war would transfer great areas of Central Europe, especially in Hungary, from Ottoman to Habsburg control, would precipitate a major rebellion and revolt and social reform within the Ottoman Empire, and basically halt the expansion that the Ottoman Empire had otherwise enjoyed since its founding in 1299 by the Sultan Osman. So yeah, this is an important thing we're dealing with. But of course, that's just the treaty itself, which basically just states that. Why this is so important, what happened? Well, for that we need to do some time for backstory. And yes, sometimes I wish I actually had the opportunity and the editing skills to put in some dramatic music in that situation. Ever since the establishment of the Ottoman Empire, and especially since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans had been advancing slowly and steadily into the Balkans and Central Europe. Repeatedly, they had tried to make further steps and further jumps into the Western and, shall we say, Western Central Europe, but had been flung back primarily at the gates of Vienna in 1529. However, despite of this, they had, without any sort of real resistance, eventually annexed most of the Balkans and what is today Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, parts of Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, Moldavia, those geographical areas, and even at one point or another expanding toward Poland. As the years have progressed, however, their, shall we say, advancement had become a bit slower, if perhaps not less steady, as their armies regularly beat the more powerful Christian forces and forced them and their primary opponents in the Holy Roman Empire to sue for various peace treaties. Then, however, in 1663, the Ottomans lost a major invasion of the Holy Roman Empire at Austria, ending at the Battle of St. Gotthard, where the Christians through the help of 6,000 French troops under a General Lafayette, had thrown back the Ottomans in confusion. However, the Habsburg monarchy and the Holy Roman Empire could not really do anything with this, because the French immediately, holding to once again to their ancient alliance with the Ottomans, now that the Ottomans were no longer in breach of said alliance, refused to help them to, well, follow up said victory. And in 1683, of course, the Sultan and his Grand Vizier decided that it was finally time to finish this annoyingly stubborn problem called the Holy Roman Empire, and launched the massive invasion that led to the Siege of Vienna and the Battle of Karlowitz. And yes, there will with absolute certainty be a video on the Battle of Vienna, of the Battle of Karlowitz and the Siege of Vienna. I have basically been waiting to do this video ever since I started this channel, and I have decided that screw it. I have mainly been holding it back because I wanted finally to maybe be able to purchase some, well, a laptop basically, so I could do some decent editing, make this actually look like something. But since that is probably a while in the future yet, I have decided to do the Battle of Karlowitz, or the Battle of Vienna, or the Siege of Vienna, or whatever you want to call it, as my 1-year anniversary video, so look forward to that. However, I might be ruining the ending of that video, but anyway, I still have to tell you that the Ottomans lost. The siege was a failure, their army was dispersed, and they had to retreat back into their areas in Hungary and Serbia particularly. This time, however, the Holy Roman Empire was not involved in a major fighting situation in Central Europe and along the Rhine, so they gathered their forces and forced the Second Holy League, or a Second Holy League, with the papacy, with Venice, with Poland, with various German princes, basically anyone who had any interest in fighting the Ottomans in a time where they actually, for the first time in hundreds and hundreds of years, actually looked fairly vulnerable. And a couple of years later, this was proven with the fall of Buda, the city that later united with Pest to form Budapest, but back then was just Buda and the old royal seats of the kings of Hungary. By this point, the Ottoman armies, not the Osman armies, the Ottoman armies had been pushed out of most of the western and northern parts of the Pannonian Plains and down towards the more mountainous Balkan areas. And this time, however, it was the armies of the Holy Roman Empire and its Holy League allies that continued to push forward. The Ottoman Empire was in disarray. There was a string of very weak and very, well, to be perfectly honest, useless Grand Viziers. There were, in fact, 19 Grand Viziers over a 17-18-year period, which cannot have done wonders for the stability of the Ottoman government under a already fairly weak sultan, or pair of sultans actually, ending with Mustafa II. Of external issues for the Ottoman Empire was the defeat at the Second Battle of Mohacs, and again, here is an apology to any Hungarian who happened to be stopping by, because yes, I am as equally horrible at pronouncing Hungarian place names as I am of pronouncing Serbian ones, so deep apologies for that. However, that was a battle in 1687, where the Holy Roman primary commander, Duke Charles of Lorraine, who had also commanded the primary imperial army during the Siege of Vienna, intercepted a Turkish invasion force marching north to regain their lost territories, and almost destroyed them and sent them hurling back. Now, The Ottomans continued to resist as best as they could, but the Austrians were pressing south as much as possible until about 1689 and the early years of the 1690s. 1689, the early years of the 1690s, where the 9-Year War broke out in Western Europe, and the Holy Roman Empire was once again facing their second primary enemy, namely France, under the rule of Louis XIV. This meant that troops had to be moved from the Balkan front to the Rhine front, and as the war in the early years did not particularly go the way of the Holy Roman Empire, they were basically facing now a two-front war, which allowed the Ottomans to gain a little breather, gain some important victories over lesser imperial commanders, and actually retake quite a bit of lost territory. At this point, one would think that the Turks were in a sort of, well, they were making a comeback, but there were problems with this. First of all, their economy was in tatters. Their government was riven by factions and rather, how to put it, inefficient at this particular time. And more importantly, the emperor decided that, well, we actually need a supreme commander again in the Balkan front, and we need someone who can take full responsibility of the whole thing instead of leaving it to local commanders. And he appointed a fellow by the name of Prince Eugene of Savoy, who would go on to be probably the primary imperial commander of his day. He is, of course, most famous for his cooperation with the Duke of Marlborough during the War of Spanish Succession. And if anyone has watched my channel before this, they will remember him from my video on the Battle of Blenheim. However, when he took over the command of the imperial armies in the Balkans in the 1690s, he immediately changed the Ottoman resurgence, beating them again and again and again, and finally catching the main Turkish armies in 1697 at the Battle of Senta, where he ambushed the Turks trying to cross a major river, a Turkish army under the direct command of the Sultan this time. He had not left it to his subordinate. He was there, he was in command, but Eugene caught them and ambushed them during a river crossing and utterly annihilated the Osman army to a degree that most of them didn't really stop running until they were back in, well, Ottoman core lands several weeks later. It was actually, even more than the siege of Vienna, the greatest military defeat the Ottomans had suffered in the European front, well, basically since the 1300s. So things were getting bad at this point. Not helping the Ottoman problems was, of course, that at this point the 9 Years' War was winding down, finally ending with a peace treaty in 1698, which allowed, again, the empire to remove troops from the Rhine front that no longer had to be used to watch over the French, and once more throw them in to the Balkans. While the empire was also at this point running dangerously short on money, it was nothing like the Ottomans, and by this point it was obvious that they could no longer hope to regain initiative and win anything in this war. Their armies have been destroyed, they had been scattered. The Janissaries, the elite sort of slave soldier forces of the Sultan, was getting incredibly restless, and overall it was absolutely a necessity to have that war ended before actually starting to lose parts of the central Balkan lands, like perhaps Serbia down to the fortress of Belgrade, or other parts of it, especially since it might be that Venice would take advantage of the situation to raid down towards Cyprus and Greece, which was something that the Ottomans could absolutely not afford at this particular time. So, in 1698, they finally managed to sue for peace. I don't know if the Empire really wanted peace, since they were obviously in the front seat now. But again, they were also rather exhausted after 16 years of continuous warfare, both physically, manpower-wise, and money-wise, especially money-wise. So, through the offices of mediation of the Dutch Republic and the Kingdom of England, who had not been involved in the struggle one way or the other, the two parties came together and eventually, as I said, settled the thing in the Treaty of Karlowitz, which was relevant as it was probably the first time that the Ottomans had officially given up as much territory as they did at this point. Practically the entire Pannonian Plain was returned to the Holy Roman Empire. Plus so many of the Balkan eyalets, which is a district in the Ottoman Empire, that they basically managed to control all of Hungary, almost all of Croatia, Slovenia, and Slavonia. The Principality of Transylvania, which has sort of always remained a kind of separate vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, was sort of remained as nominally independent as it has always been, but switched from Ottoman overseers to Austrian overseers. At the same time, Poland, who had been part of the Holy League, recovered the province of Podolia, including several former fortresses they had lost, and Venice obtained most of Dalmatia, which is basically the coastline of Croatia, Serbia, and, well, not Serbia, but the coastlines of Croatia and Slovenia and that kind of area, along with the entire Morea, which was basically the Peloponnese Peninsula of southern Greece, though 20 years later, after a second minor war, or lesser war, Morea was restored to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, at this particular point, managed to retain Belgrade and most parts of Wallachia, Moldavia, and what is today Romania, and, of course, had to count themselves fairly lucky about that, since they had also been in a separate war with the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, which would, of course, in very close due time become the Tsardom of Russia. They also had to sign a separate contract with them that allowed the Russians access to the Black Sea and actually control of much of the area down towards Crimea. Primarily the entire Azov region, for those who has knowledge of Russian areas. So yeah, at that point, the wars ended. For about 20 years there was peace until another minor war happened. But what was the consequences of the Treaty of Karlowitz? Well, first of all, it was the end of Muslim, if you want to call it that, or at least Ottoman expansion into Europe. While there was a bit of seesawing over the next 50 years regarding the boundaries, this was the last time the Ottomans had any chance of conquering new lands. From this moment on, it would be bickering over stuff they've already had, and the continual lessening of their empire up until they would become the sick man of Europe in the 19th century, and of course ending so, how to put it, ignominiously after the First World War. It also practically finally destroyed the authority of the Grand Vizier in the Ottoman Empire. It led directly to the Edirne event, or the Edirne event, which I will go over in a second, and it destroyed once and for all, of course, the sort of myth of Ottoman superiority that led to disunity within the Christian kingdoms opposing it, as everyone could now see that not only could they be defeated, they would probably be able to be defeated in the future, thus creating a strong and lasting defensive alliance against further Ottoman resurgence. In the West, it created it sort of cemented Habsburg and thereby imperial control over Central Europe. It laid the foundation to the later Austro-Hungarian Empire, when the Holy Roman Empire's internal inconsistencies had finally caught up with it, by returning Royal Hungary and the Pannonian Plains firmly to the hands of the Habsburg monarchy. It raised the standard of the Habsburg monarchy to a position never really seen before, and rendered them the primary sort of power in Central Europe and the primary rivals of Louis XIV in his ambitions to dominate Central Europe and the Rhinelands. So yeah, it gave Venice one last sort of shot at legitimacy, which was then lost as the Venetian Empire, or the Venetian Republic, also went into its final decline, despite this last attempt to, well, basically regain some legitimacy. The last thing I want to talk about is the Edirne event. I will probably do a real video on the Edirne event eventually, but let me just shortly say that as a result of the humiliation of the Treaty of Karlowitz, which was rightly, of course, seen as a humiliation of the entire Ottoman Empire, and the attempts of the Sultan Mustafa to sort of restructure his domains and gain some more tax income and so on, eventually led to a major revolt by his Janissary elite forces that the regular army eventually joined and deposed of said Sultan Mustafa II, who was, according to the official messages out from the Ottoman Empire at the time, not hurt the least, but was allowed to live out the remains of his life in his royal palace. The remains of that life was about 6 months, so whether or not he just got really depressed and died for that, or if there was some less than normal reasons for his demise, is of course a question for another time. But what it did mean was as I said, basically the loss of the almost complete successful power, dominant power that the Grand Viziers had earlier faced, and the final establishment of the Janissaries as a sort of Praetorian Guard in deposing and placing sultans on the throne, and basically placing themselves as a ruling soldier caste in the Ottoman Empire, which also definitely was one of the greater causes of decline in Ottoman power and prestige over the next couple of centuries. But again, I will probably in the end return to the Edirne event in a separate video. Well, that was it. And yes, as you can see on the shirt, this is shot on a different day than I shot the intro. Such is the vagaries of video shooting sometimes if you don't have an animated avatar. And maybe I should get an animated avatar. Nah, too many animals up there. Anyway, so this was the Treaty of Karlowitz. I hope you found it interesting. As I said, it is really primarily interesting because it was the final stop of the Ottoman expansions into Central Europe, and really the final stop of Muslim expansion towards Christian Europe, and set up the way Europe functioned from around 1700 to around the First World War. So yeah, very important thing, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, I will probably return to the Edirne event sometime, and I will definitely do the Battle of Vienna, or the Siege of Vienna, in the middle of December. Because, well, screw it, it's time. Until then, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.